The tiny pink blanket trembled in my arms as I waited for the man I loved to take just one step closer. 2 hours earlier, after 20 hours of painful labor, our daughter had entered the world with a soft cry that instantly became the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Yet instead of smiling, my husband stood frozen near the hospital window, staring into the darkness outside. The nurse gently encouraged him to hold his baby, but he quietly shook his head and walked away without even looking at her face. In that heartbreaking moment, I felt a different kind of pain, one no medicine could heal. If you had just brought your child into the world and the person you trusted most refused to embrace that precious life, what would you believe? Would you think love had disappeared forever, or would you still hold on to hope? Our names were Rachel and Matthew, and we had spent 6 years dreaming of becoming parents in our quiet home outside Columbus, Ohio. We had painted the nursery together, laughed over tiny baby clothes, argued playfully about bedtime stories, and imagined every first moment that was waiting for us. Matthew had always been the gentle one. He volunteered at church, helped elderly neighbors shovel snow, and cried during sentimental movies even when he pretended not to. That was why his reaction in the hospital made no sense. It was as though someone had replaced the man I knew with a complete stranger. The nurses exchanged worried glances, assuming he was simply overwhelmed, while I tried to convince myself that exhaustion could explain everything. Still, every minute he stayed away from our daughter felt like another crack spreading across my heart. The night became painfully long. Our beautiful baby girl slept peacefully beside my bed, completely unaware that her first hours in the world were wrapped in silence instead of celebration. Matthew remained outside the room for most of the evening, sitting alone in the waiting area. He answered my texts with only a few words, saying he needed time. Every mother imagines the first family photograph, the first kiss on the baby's forehead, the first tears of happiness shared together. Instead, I stared at an empty chair beside my bed and wondered whether our family had already begun falling apart before it had truly begun. Around midnight, one of the older nurses quietly sat beside me. She told me that sometimes fathers reacted differently after childbirth. Fear, shock, and anxiety could bury emotions beneath layers of confusion. She encouraged me not to assume the worst before morning arrived. Her kindness comforted me for a while, but every time I looked at our daughter sleeping peacefully, I wondered whether she would one day ask why her father never held her on the day she was born. Some questions can haunt a parent long before a child is old enough to ask them. Matthew barely slept that night. Unknown to me, he wandered through the nearly empty hospital hallways carrying a burden he had never shared. When he was only 8 years old, his younger sister had died from a rare heart condition only days after birth. His father never recovered from that tragedy and slowly disappeared emotionally from the family. Matthew had spent decades convincing himself that loving someone deeply only guaranteed unbearable pain. When our daughter was born, every buried memory returned at once. Looking at her tiny face filled him with overwhelming love, but that love awakened a terrifying fear that he might lose her too. Instead of embracing her, he instinctively pulled away, believing that distance would somehow protect his heart from another lifetime of grief. Just before sunrise, Matthew found himself standing outside the hospital chapel. The elderly hospital janitor noticed his tear-filled eyes and quietly sat beside him. Without asking many questions, the man simply spoke about his own life. Years earlier, he had lost his wife to cancer after 50 years of marriage. He admitted that if fear of loss had stopped him from loving her, he would have missed the greatest gift God had ever given him. His final words stayed with Matthew like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. Love was never meant to guarantee safety. It was meant to give life meaning, even when tomorrow was uncertain. The next morning changed everything. As the first rays of sunlight entered my hospital room, I heard slow footsteps approaching the door. Matthew walked inside looking completely different. His eyes were swollen from crying, and his hands trembled as though carrying invisible weight. Without speaking, he came beside my bed and looked at our sleeping daughter for the very first time. Tears rolled freely down his face before he carefully lifted her into his arms. The moment her tiny fingers wrapped around one of his, something inside him finally broke open. He wasn't holding fear anymore. He was holding his little girl. Watching them together erased the loneliness of the previous night. Matthew gently kissed her forehead over and over, whispering apologies she could not yet understand but that somehow healed both of us. He later confessed everything he had hidden for years, the memories of his sister, the fear of repeating history, the belief that loving someone too much invited heartbreak. Instead of judging him, I simply cried with him because I realized his refusal had never been about rejecting our daughter. It had been about a frightened little boy still trapped inside a grown man's heart. The weeks that followed were not perfect, but they were honest. Matthew began meeting with a counselor to face the grief he had buried since childhood. Every evening after work, he rushed home just to rock our daughter to sleep. He learned every lullaby, mastered diaper changes, and proudly carried her through neighborhood parks as though introducing the world to his greatest treasure. Friends who had witnessed his strange behavior at the hospital could hardly believe he had become the most devoted father they had ever seen. Years later, whenever our daughter laughed while running into her father's arms, I sometimes remembered those painful first hours after her birth. They no longer filled me with sadness. Instead, they reminded me that people often carry invisible wounds no one else can see. The moments that look like rejection may actually be desperate battles happening deep inside someone's heart. Healing begins when fear is finally replaced by love, honesty, and the courage to face yesterday instead of running from it. Before the story ends, tell us in the comments, have you ever witnessed a moment when love overcame fear and changed someone's life forever? Our daughter never remembered the 2 painful hours when her father couldn't hold her, but she spent the rest of her childhood wrapped safely in his arms. Sometimes the most beautiful families are not the ones that begin perfectly, they are the ones that choose forgiveness, understanding, and second chances when everything seems broken. And perhaps that is the greatest miracle of all, love does not ask us to be fearless. It simply asks us not to let fear have the final word. If this story truly touched your heart, please like, comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe for more emotional stories that remind us of the power of love, kindness, and second chances.